This is Maui Community College, with a world of knowledge here at home.
Welcome to a special edition of BUS 420, Global Business Strategy. 15 hours ago, Port-au-Prince, the capital of Haiti, was hit with a 7.0 magnitude earthquake on a Richter scale. It's very appropriate when you watch the images, as I've done since last night, of the havoc, the destruction, and the need to create mechanisms to deal with so many cases of loss and destruction, and the words fail me. So I want to talk a little bit before we go into our formal lecture today about the meaning of disasters, not only in terms of risks and dangers, but also opportunities in the globalization process, and what they mean in terms of expectations, in terms of building infrastructure, in terms of delivering services, in terms of finding what role we have in the globalization process, not only in Hawaii, but in general, as American society, as a Pacific society. And so I would like you to see if you can contribute any thoughts on this, especially in addition to the regular assignment. Write me a little paragraph of what you think might be relevant in terms of rebuilding Haiti. Now, most people do not know Haiti. It's an island Caribbean nation, often described as the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. Per capita income, I would say, is probably less than $150 a month. And when you drive through, I haven't been in Haiti in over 20 years, but not much has changed. I can tell from the images, it's just more people. We're talking about millions of people in the capital. We're talking about a small island nation that's part of the island of Hispaniola that shares with another Caribbean country called the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic is relatively well off at the same standard of living as most Caribbean nations. It is Spanish-speaking. Haiti is French-speaking, was part of the French colonial empire. It prides itself on being the first democratic country in the Western Hemisphere. But that hasn't helped it much. It has been the scene of dictatorships, turmoil, and thievery and corruption, whatever adjectives you can use about a failed state almost. In the past 10 years, it had the benefit, if you can call it that, of the United Nations peacekeeping force trying to manage the country, trying to bring some semblance of order, several coups, some supported by the United States, some engineered by the United States, and others supported by other interested players. The Haitian community in America is sizable. The expatriate community, working primarily in places like Florida and New York State, often doing menial work, although those expatriates often have been people who were at least able to leave. Some of you may know Haiti by some of its cultural relationships in terms of popular media, with voodoo, black magic. Another word, the French word "tonton macoute," was the terror squads that were enforcing the dictators, Papa Doc Duvalier's will among the people. The people were kept in fear with all kinds of primitive ideas and ideological and religious forces. Traveling in Haiti in the countryside at night, no electricity. You see torches and encampments. You hear the drums of the voodoo drums. It's a really scary place. Hanging chicken heads, all kinds of very quaint or unusual, more anthropological curiosities than reality. Several countries tried to help without much success, and when you look at the pictures this morning and listen to the words of their prime minister, that they anticipate at least 100,000 dead from the earthquake. And I would anticipate at least 2 to 3 million homeless within one quick incident. This is the worst earthquake in 250 years in the region, and will really test not only the desire of other countries in the globalized world that we live in to help, but also some of the issues that come in trying to help people. And we often think living in a modern country with Western technology, with Western ideas and organization and skills, that we can make any place better. And I think that's part of our hubris. When we went into Iraq or Afghanistan or Vietnam in the late 60s and so on, that in America or in the West in general, we can fix anything. Well, some things are unfixable. And this may really test the truth of this particular statement. What we see that happens in the next day, in the next month, in the next year. Because when you look at the scenery, even the one unstable structure, which was the palace, which was an architectural curiosity, has collapsed, the governmental palace. The biggest damage has been to the UN headquarters, which collapsed. The hospital collapsed. So you can imagine the normal services that we take for granted, the normal infrastructure. And I think that what I want to convey more than anything else is infrastructure. We're living in a society that infrastructure is critical in globalization and international business in general. It's not enough to have the desire, it's not enough to have the money if you don't have the roads, if you don't have the waterways, you don't have the ports. Excuse me. One of the big issues is Haiti has only one international airport with one runway. How do you bring supplies in by air, even though it's only about an hour and a half away from Florida? What is really interesting that caught my eye this morning is that America, and probably FEMA, or what was left of FEMA that is now Homeland Security, has got much better at disaster management. At least they have the steps right. And it was interesting to watch that in the staging areas, whether they're in Georgia or North Carolina, wherever the Homeland Security staging areas are, the first team that goes into any disaster is the assessment team. And I mention this because in globalization and in international business, this is critical. We talk about assessment. Okay, assessment. In fact, in the project that I described on Monday, assessment. Find out what's going on. Find out what there is. Find out what needs to be. But before you can bring any help, you got to know. Because you can't just come up to the airport, one runway, start landing planes. One waits for the next one to take off, unloading it. What are you doing with the stuff? The roads are collapsed. The houses are collapsed. Even before the earthquake, when you go into Port of Prince, Port of Spain is Trinidad. When you go to Port of Prince, you can't even move among the houses. There are no streets. Everything is like attached to each other. Everything collapsed because you have these hovels or favelas, as they are in Rio de Janeiro and Mexico. So the things that we take for granted, being able to deliver help when we see an accident on the road, or we can bring helicopters, we can use a bypass road, we can come in another way. None of this exists. So, infrastructure is critical. Assessment is the first step. After you assess, only then can you decide what you're going to send. And it was interesting to see how the planning goes, how critical it is in terms of planning what goes first. People all the time think that, when you have so many deceased people, so many bodies in the streets, we're talking at least 100,000 bodies in the street. We always hear that there is a health danger of decomposing bodies. Unless the people were sick, there's very little danger. That's not the danger. The danger is that all your systems break down in a situation like that. Can you think of some of the systems that we take for granted in terms of infrastructure beside the road? What do we take for granted every day when we get up in the morning out of bed? What's the first thing we do?
Power?
Before we need power, where do we go? What do we usually do when we get out of bed after a night's sleep? Where do we go?
Bathroom.
The bathroom. We take it so for granted. You go to the bathroom and pull a lever. We don't even think twice about it, do we? But what happens if there's nothing, if water, first of all, the water pipes are all gone and the sewer pipes are all gone. So all the fancy American plumbing fixtures or whoever, sells you the fixture, they're just nice fixtures that don't do anything. Very, very critical. And I was just thinking about watching Brandy over here about her involvement with the concrete business. Boy, that's an opportunity. But how do you get 30 trucks over to halfway around the world? So, again, opportunity is not enough to do a project or to get something done. A lot of factors have to go in, and I think that's what's so critical in the globalized process. It's not just going around the corner. How to deliver it necessary. We saw that in Hurricane Katrina, which was a classic case of mismanagement of project. And that's why the project in this course is very important. I want you to think about some of these issues. So here you are, you have this huge city with millions of people. If I remember correctly, I think there were 9 million people in Haiti or 9 million people in Port-au-Prince. 3 million are going to be homeless. How do you provide 3 million tents? Where do you put the tents? Because you got rubble over it. How do you set this on? What do you do in a country that's so poor that doesn't have the skill, what we call the human capital? What happens when we have something in the U.S.? What's the first group we look for help when we have a natural disaster? Who gets called out? National Guard, which is a backup, a reserve for the military. What do you have in a country where there is no national guard? How do you even have government? When we talk about some of the necessary infrastructure, what about the political infrastructure? Who can decide what planes land? I listened to the communications in the airport in Haiti this morning. The communications is barely surviving. They can't even communicate on more than one frequency with the airplane. Nothing works. Very primitive. We're talking in terms of infrastructure the way Hawaii was maybe 150 years ago. And yet you want to deliver 21st century tools. So you have to be totally self-contained. And one of the lessons from some of the issues we are facing globally in terms of energy, in terms of climate warming, in terms of overpopulation, in terms of food production, in terms of high energy costs, is what are some of the solutions that have to fit the 21st century? We have to think about things differently. We have to think more modularly. Maybe we have to think in terms of pre-built things. We're so used to having custom things. Maybe we have to learn how to do mass production, especially for situations where you may need to house people whose city may be inundated along the coast without warning. So, opportunities, the question is, who's going to pay? Big question when you're doing a global thing. Who's going to pay? Well, Haiti happens to be a basket case country that's been, as I said, patrolled by United Nations forces. Even from Israel, they sent a special police unit to train the police because everybody had to be trained, retrained, because after you had the gangs, after the dictator Duvalier, Papadakis, and other dictators came. And this is just a regeneration. Again, and now suddenly you have a natural calamity. what really amazed me is I watched the picture, the people huddling around, sitting around, the calmness with which they accepted their fate. It's kind of a fatalism. People just accepting. Now, when we talk about operating in another country, culture is very important. People who are fatalistic, they're not the kind of people who are going to become entrepreneurs, are they? So many times you have to export even entrepreneurial energy. You have to bring the spark. You have to be also the driving force. And it takes years to build up this kind of culture. Because these people have been acclimatized to be taken care of, to become dependent. And there are some people who claim that even in American society, we become dependent on government or on social institutions to take care of us. So maybe it's a whole education process that has to take place. And one of the things we try to do in this program is to teach people how to become entrepreneurs, how to take care of their own destiny. And I guess we used to do it anyway. If we're talking about a country being knocked back to the 19th century, and one of the issues was that part of the destruction of Haiti started a long time ago. People had no jobs, no money, so what did they do? They cut down all the trees in the country for firewood so they could cook. Makes sense, but once they cut down all the fire trees, since there's a lot of hurricanes in the Caribbean, every time there's a hurricane, it causes massive flooding and kills 800, 1,000 people, 2,000 people. Because the trees used to hold the watershed. Imagine if we didn't have all the farmers in Hawaii. Just the rain came. What would happen to the coastal areas? They'd be flooded all the time. Even on Oahu, it happens quite often when the Manoa Stream overfloods and fills the Alawa and there's flooding over there. Just imagine the whole area of living. Haiti is an island just like that. Except that on one side is the country of Dominican Republic, as I mentioned, and the other side is Haiti, and the Dominican Republic haven't cut down their trees. They have a very developed hotel infrastructure and so on. So this is some of the things I want you to keep in mind today as we talk about some of the opportunities and threats in globalization. And people bandy around globalization, but I want to tell you that we discussed on the first day that the concept of globalization and self-sufficiency regionally may come much more into focus as we go back in some ways in terms of our thinking of the future as one big country. We may be one big country in terms of the whole world, but we may have to regionally supply ourselves with different products and services, as we never thought we would have to do. We always thought that we could have cheap transportation, and we may yet have that. But it may make more sense for us to become self-dependent, So, we're going to talk about several concepts. One of those concepts is what we call international business. Okay? International business used to be the name of the courses such as we're studying now. But it is basically when you have any kind of commercial transactions across national borders. So that's international business. I think that definition may change as the concept of nation-state becomes weaker, or as you get global or regional organization like the Economic Union of the Europe, the EU, as you get Mercosur being more powerful in South America, as you have NAFTA, maybe some of those definitions will get blurred. Another concept we want to keep in mind is imports. Okay, can anybody tell me what an import is?
A good or service that is brought in from a different country.
And an export is a good or service that you send out of the country someplace else. And we talked last time also about the role of technology. The fact that e-business and e-commerce may make a whole different perspective possible especially in the purchasing and selling of goods and services. So just because you don't manufacture something, or you don't create something, you can still become the broker from selling from one place to another. You can become the distributor of many things, where you don't have to physically take control. And we talked about those type of issues last time. What do we need for technology to take over? Well, then we need several things. One of the things that we need is first to identify potential customers for whatever we want to support. Do we want to sell a service or a product? Do we need to collaborate with someone? Do we need to have strategic alliances? Strategic alliances are very critical in international business. Because this time and date, we still have divisions in terms of culture, in terms of language, in terms of procedures, in terms of standardization. We're going to discuss all of these issues. They are not incidental, they're quite important. And to make something happen internationally, you really have to have a lot of what we call global capital, or global manpower, and talent. And again, if you look at this particular incident of the Haitian earthquake and the side effects and results that are going to happen, I think we're going to be looking at an international effort, because it's more than any one country can take the responsibility. Now remember, we have here another issue. We have a country that's a francophone. What does that mean, francophone? Not your name. What does that mean, francophone? You got a big on your name, no? It means something that's French-based. Okay, francophile is someone who's interested in French culture, or French-based. And we used to think that performing these functions of export and import on a global basis increases competition and efficiency. But as we have learned and we discussed in the first session, with the cost of transportation and several international global issues confronting the planet, including sustainability, pollution, the depletion of resources such as petroleum products, the distribution of violent militant behavior on the part of certain extremist groups and ideologies. So it doesn't always make what we think would naturally be efficient worthwhile. We've seen also another concept that has disturbed the idea of globalization on the political level, and that's a concept that we call the failed state. We always thought that every state had someone responsible for it. We could point to a government. We could point to, leadership. We could point to a king, to a constitution. And suddenly we find out that they are failed states. We're just a group of terrorists or criminals who can take control. We're on the lookout because we saw the ramifications and the results of having a failed state in Afghanistan. We're seeing a failed state in Somalia, and we may see a few other failed states as time goes on. We're seeing another potential failed state in Yemen. And so again, assess what's happening. Can anybody tell me what country Yemen shares a border with? Yes. Saudi Arabia, right. Yemen is on the Saudi Peninsula, on the bottom. It's a state that's basically very tribal, Lots of conflicts over the last 50 years. They were a colony of Great Britain, just as was most of the Middle East, except for Lebanon and Syria. And before that, they were wards of the Ottoman Empire that dissolved in World War I, and as a result of Kemal Atatürk making it a Western nation called Turkey. So lots of political forces, and if you don't understand the ramification of the politics, you can go in there not knowing what you're doing and lose your head. And I'm talking physically and figuratively. So when you're in Yemen, there's a danger that it's a failed state. And normally people don't get too excited about failed state unless they threaten them. And everybody after, what was that movie about the Somalia invasion by American forces? Black Hawk Down was a movie that described how a Marine brigade or an Army brigade comes under attack and gets decimated by tribal bands of guerrillas. And once that happened, the Americans pulled out and thought, we're never going back to Somalia. And guess what? Something happened. Somalia decided to go into a different business. What business are they in? Piracy. Piracy is good business. Now, if any of you want to start a really good entrepreneurship program, now that's just really a good business. Piracy. Now, we can't take any more East Africa because the Somalians have that one, so maybe we could do the Pacific. Yeah, you know, any ship that comes by, you just come with a high-speed cigarette boat and a RPG or a grenade launcher, attack it, threaten the captain, take it hostage, take it back to your home base, and ransom it for anywhere between $3 and $40 million. Not bad for a day's work. So suddenly it perked our interest again, because it's disturbing our globalization process of sending goods and services across the open ocean. So this obviously, the piracy has created new entrepreneurial opportunities in preventing piracy. It's become a big business. We thought that was finished by back in the 19th century with Captain Hook or Cook. We thought all those things were done. Boom. What goes around comes around. And here we have again anti-piracy. They used to bring up navies to deal with that. It wasn't a private business, but now it looks like companies are going to that business to protect commercial shipping. Because recently they've also captured some big tankers with lots of oil. And oil is a more expensive product than gold. So you can't just let it be taken hostage. So all these processes play havoc with our nice, clean, theoretical concept of what globalization is all about. It's not neatly tied, it's not neat at all. Global commerce has all kind of influences in terms of politics, military, failed states, needs, services. Who's going to be responsible? What alliances are going to be in effect? And certainly the issue of global terror, which is a tool used by people with ideological or perhaps mercantile needs, wanting to take over or steal or change ideology or change people's religion, or just take power for its own sake, will have a determining effect on many of the globalization processes. Before we talk any further, I want you to see a movie that Jeremy is going to show us today about globalization, so you get a little bit better handle on what we mean. So, Maestro, anytime.
Every day we hear people talk about how the world is shrinking. Advancements in transportation and communications are bringing people from all over the world in closer contact with each other, making them more aware of what is available and what they might sell to people abroad. They may argue about borders, religions, and politics, but take a look around and you'll see many people are demanding goods and services from the same countries that they may have felt so uncomfortable coming into close contact with. They're sipping Cokes, paying for meals with American Express cards, driving Toyotas and Mercedes, and wearing shoes made in Italy, Vietnam, or Brazil. Global business has been growing rapidly in recent decades because of technological expansion, liberalization of governmental policies on international trade and resource movements, development of institutions needed to support and facilitate international transactions, and increased global competition. Because of all of these factors, companies increasingly use foreign countries as a source of both production and sales. Globalization has become inevitable. All countries permit some level of foreign trade, although some permit more than others. Most governments have conclusively decided that global trade and investment can benefit their countries and their people. Private companies have also realized that the best opportunities for growth and profits often come from outside their home countries. Despite the pervasive influence of globalization, it is hard to pin down one definition that will suit everybody. For our purposes, globalization refers to an interdependent world economy in which people in one part of the world interact with people in another part as buyers, sellers, or intermediaries. Globalization is not without controversy, and the critics offer a few key arguments. 1. Some people lose while others gain, both in absolute and relative terms. 2. Countries diminish their sovereignty. 3. National cultures change and become diluted. 4. Governments have fewer ways to monitor companies and hold them accountable. Some gain, some lose. Despite the growth of global trade and investment, there's very little consensus on whether globalization has benefited the majority of people it has impacted. Advocates of global trade and investment, who often come from developed areas like the US, Canada, and Western Europe, argue that globalization, by giving consumers more choices and forcing companies to compete, has created economic growth and millions of jobs. This growth has provided investment for building roads, airports, factories, and basic infrastructure in less developed countries. During the 1990s, foreign investors poured over $1 trillion into developing countries like India, China, Brazil, and Mexico, raising the standard of living faster than most thought possible in a single decade. Further, the developing countries that open their borders most to imports, such as Chile and Singapore, are the ones that have grown the fastest. Until recently, it took at least 2 generations for living standards to double, but now, in places like China, living standards double every 10 years. Despite this progress, critics argue that increased globalization has contributed to income inequalities, both between and within countries. Critics also argue that when companies move production from a developed to a developing country to take advantage of cheaper labor supply, they barely improve the economic well-being of their new workers while causing immeasurable hardship to the workers they displaced. Although this displacement is similar to what occurs from technological changes, workers react differently. In developed areas like the US or Europe, frustration from workers displaced by globalization has led to increased support for protectionism rather than job retraining. Critics also claim that cost savings from using cheaper labor go mainly to shareholders in developed countries rather than to consumers or to stakeholders in developing countries. In the past 2 decades, we've heard a lot about the abuse of sweatshops in developing countries. Whether it's the leather industry in India or a garment factory in China, labor activists argue that companies use cheap labor pools in different countries to keep their product costs very low. Additionally, they can avoid the cost of providing benefits or decent working conditions. However, the ethics of such practices are not so clear-cut. For many workers, these sweatshop jobs, while not ideal or decent by Western standards, may be the best they can find. In some countries, such as India or Colombia, a local worker may earn only a few dollars a day in a sweatshop, but this pay may well be above the local minimum wage and well above what the worker could earn elsewhere for a similar job. Pay a sweatshop worker only $1 per unit to make a product, such as a sweater or a pair of shoes, but charge the end consumer $50 for the fruits of their labor. In some cases, companies can end up paying more money to a celebrity to promote a product than the paid workers to make it. This is what creates the huge inequality between the workers who produce the goods and the people who sell them. When buying from companies in developing countries, many Western firms try to address this labor issue by stipulating in their contracts that working conditions must be of certain acceptable standards, like not using child labor or protection from hazardous materials. However, in practice, it is difficult for the companies to monitor compliance with these kinds of contract stipulations, especially when the manufacturing facilities are far away. Although some developing countries have grown rapidly while opening their economies to world trade and investment, some of the poorest countries have not. Simply, they lack the basic infrastructure and education to participate fully in globalization and, as a result, have become poorer in relation to the richer countries. The near-term reality is that while globalization may be good for the world as a whole, not everyone wins in the process. Human nature is such that we often fear change, even if it can improve overall conditions for the majority of people. Over the long run, most agree that globalization will help improve conditions for the broadest segment of the world. National sovereignty. For many people, particularly those in developing regions such as Asia, Latin America, and Africa, globalization is often viewed with suspicion, not only because they fear that big foreign companies will benefit themselves at the expense of their local population, but also because they fear that these companies will be instruments of their home country's political interests. Bear in mind that many developing countries have a short history of independence, and their citizens remember when colonial powers controlled them. Thus, they often restrict foreign trade and investment to benefit their national interests. However, developed countries also limit international trade and investment. Although the United States is considered one of the more open economies, its government influences both foreign trade and foreign investment for economic and political reasons. For example, the United States limits foreign ownership in its strategically important industries, such as transportation, communications, and military hardware. On the other side of the world, Japan has long used economic policy to influence trade by promoting exports and discouraging imports. The Japanese have also successfully used government policy to promote certain key industries with global potential. Hence, the early government support for the automobile and electronics industries in the 1960s and 1970s. However, critics of globalization argue that countries can't enforce policies that they think are in the better interest of their citizens. They argue that global governing bodies like the World Trade Organization, or WTO, the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and regional trading groups, such as the European Union, dictate policy to countries rather than let them come up with their own policies. Many labor and environmental groups are concerned that these organizations are spinning out of control, that they are overly powerful global organizations that are accountable only to wealthy corporate interests, intent on increasing their coffers at the expense of local governments and people. These opponents of supranational organizations believe their national governments should have the sovereign right to enact and implement domestic legislation. The reality is that these supranational organizations have established means to smooth the path of globalization. Take the WTO, which has been successful in creating and enforcing rules for global trade. Let's look at an example of U.S. beef. When the European Union tried to block the imports of hormone-treated beef, the WTO struck down the European regulations that denied U.S. beef access to European markets. The WTO authorized the U.S. to retaliate by restricting entry of European goods, but only within strict guidelines on the volume and type of these goods. Advocates of the WTO and globalization argue that in the absence of a world body, a country might have retaliated much more harshly. In essence, the WTO helped moderate the debate and mitigate the response. Many people are concerned about the perceived loss of national sovereignty caused by these supranational organizations. However, globalists argue that economic interdependence helps keep a balance among governments. A country may be less prone to take economic or political actions against a country with which it is mutually interdependent. Further, they argue that governments will be encouraged to provide a base level of social standards for workers to maintain their standing in this global organization. For example, some activists see the United Nations, particularly some of its subgroups, such as the International Labor Organization, as the missing link in the international system that can help control the excesses of globalization and spread the gains more evenly. Diluting local culture. It's clear from what we see around the world that more contact among countries brings about cultural change. Depending on one's viewpoint, this may be for better or worse. Currently, culture of the United States, which is the strongest international trading and investing nation, has permeated many cultures around the world. As a result, many fear an Americanization of their culture, and people sometimes refer to as Coca-colonization. For example, in January 1990, when the first McDonald's opened in Moscow, almost 30,000 Russians braved the winter cold to experience their first American Big Mac. In contrast, one critic of U.S. cultural inroads is France, which at times has prohibited the business use of U.S. terms such as le weekend and le drugstore, and protects its movie industry. As the almighty dollar encroaches on the French way of life, McDonald's bashing has been hailed as an act of heroism. Indeed, Jose Bové, the leader of the radical farmers who bombed a McDonald's in Millau in 1999, has become a national icon, and by 2001 he became an international one as he took up the banner of the anti-globalization movement. Those who fear French cultural dilution can take solace in the country's ability to influence European policies and to keep the French language in use internationally. For example, the European representative at the 1999 WTO debates in Seattle was French. Travel further east, and you'll find that Asian countries have fretted over the influx of U.S. pop culture through programming like MTV and fast food eateries like McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken, and Pizza Hut, which have penetrated overseas markets and gained widespread acceptance. At the same time, Americans are gravitating to foreign products and concepts, French wines, Thai food, and Indian mysticism, which are changing the essence of U.S. culture. Corporate accountability. The debate on globalization often ends up focusing on the ability to control international companies. Critics claim that they avoid paying taxes and avoid adhering to strict environmental and labor standards by moving operations to countries with more lax regulations than their home countries. Certainly, some of the financial irregularities uncovered in the early 21st century confirm these allegations. For instance, Enron hid many of its losses by setting up dummy corporations in countries with secrecy laws and liberal tax regulations. Yet globalists argue that the answer is not to thwart international economic interdependence, but rather for countries to work more closely together to develop and agree on standards for corporate accountability and means of monitoring their compliance throughout the world. In summary, the impact of globalization is not always black or white. Take as an example India. Until the early 1990s, India chose to keep out most foreign investment for a variety of political and economic reasons. By the early 1990s, its leaders concluded that the Asian miracle of economic growth might bypass the country unless they opened up their markets. Thus, the government began to liberalize its policies and welcome foreign companies and investment. Today, if you travel through the streets of Mumbai, it used to be called Bombay, you'll see the stark contrast of high-tech businesses next to extreme poverty and shantytown living. Nevertheless, if you ask most Indians, they will tell you that liberalization and global trade have been good for the country by creating a larger and richer middle class than existed a decade before. Indian software engineers now provide a significant portion of technology services for global firms, ranging from high-tech giants like Apple and Microsoft to banks, insurance companies, and conglomerates like Hyundai, Citibank, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, Ford, and Philips. Even the plight of some of the poorest has been lifted as the national standard of living has increased. Take a look inside the makeshift shanty homes that can be found all over India, and you're likely to see at least a radio and a cell phone, and possibly a television. The debate on globalization will continue as people try to make sure that the benefits of global trade outweigh the costs for all countries, not just a select few. Through the process, global organizations like the WTO and UN will work to provide a framework to level the playing field for all countries, promote and protect the rights of workers and basic human values everywhere, and encourage companies to be responsible global citizens.
So let's look a little bit in more detail about this whole process. And let's think about the opportunities that exist for us if we go global. One, quite often people in domestic corporation, domestic industry, find out that they have maxed the market. There's no more customers. Everybody has been stagnating. The product has become mature. Remember the product life cycle? We start with introduction, growth, maturity, decline. But quite often there are many countries, as we've seen in the film, and as you know from our personal experience, that haven't reached that maturity stage in development of certain products and services. So globalization gives us the opportunity to introduce new markets to products that have been well established in the United States. Think even just about the evolution of Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola started out in the 19th century in America as like a cough syrup, and eventually became a drink that still tastes like cough syrup to some people, to me included, but has taken many transformations. Quite often, the new products will be tried out first in the domestic market, or vice versa. But for instance, how many of you remember the original name of Diet Coke? Anybody remember the original name? It was called Tab. Tab. When Diet Coke first came out, sugar substitute was called Tab. They tried it out, but then they found it didn't have really a universal appeal, and Coke has always had big dreams and big ambitions, which it's been able to implement with its huge advertising and promotional budgets. And also having a distributorship network, they were able to pipe new product into the pipeline. So they introduced, if you remember the story of Classic Coke, New Coke, and Diet Coke. And eventually they bought up more soft drink labels like Fanta and all kinds of other products and spread them all around. But in the rest of the world, Diet Coke doesn't exist in most places. It's called Light Coke. Okay, so it's Light Coke. Why? Because when you're going into the third world, or when you're going to countries where there isn't enough food, the last thing you want to preach to people, they should be on a diet. They're trying to get some food to eat, and you tell them, no, drink Diet Coke. You'll feel even less than you had before. If you were hungry before, now you'll feel even skinnier. Well, hey. So it's very culturally based, and they've been able to adapt very well. Not to be outdone, Pepsi has done the same way. So once you've established a domestic brand, you might find that you've maxed out or plateaued the domestic desire or need. And also remember, America is not a country that's growing in terms of number, even though we have over 300 million people. The growth rate of industrialized and Western countries is a lot lower than other countries around the globe, especially when you consider India, China, Asia, Africa, and so on. So new markets is definitely an opportunity you want to take advantage. Reduction in tariff is another globalization opportunity. Until recently, as recently as maybe 20, 30 years ago, there were barriers to trading, to protect markets, to protect industries in your domestic economy. The world is opened up with the World Trade Organization. People sign into it so they can introduce their products, export them, but they also have to open their markets so that they can be able to import products. And that's one of the amazing miracles of China, has been actually the ability to export such vast amount of cheap product. They've been able to do this because of the labor resources that they have in terms of number of people, and they've been able to do it also because the labor pool is fairly inexpensive compared to the rest of the world. They've also accomplished it by keeping their value of their currency low, so their production costs are low compared to the dollar and the euro. So in such a way that it doesn't even make sense in America to produce toys, to produce clothing, or any other products that have become to the level of mature products. That is why countries such as the United States and countries in Europe and the European Union are constantly in search of high technology, development of new technology, so they have a competitive advantage. Remember, marketing, competitive advantage. And one of the competitive advantages is having low-cost labor, One of the competitive advantages for the West is having high-tech and new products, always the newness. That's why in American culture also we produce new. New is good. Old is bad. New is good. Even if we don't need it, as long as it's new, it's good. Just think how many times you've traded in your young lives your cell phone. You remember your first cell phone, Randy? What brand was it? Sprint. Well, I'm talking in terms of the phone itself. Do you remember that? LG. And what do you have now? Oh, you like that brand. You stayed with the LG. Okay. How about you?
Yeah.
Okay. What do you have now?
LG.
LG. Okay.
I had a Nokia, and now I have a BlackBerry.
Okay.
I think it was Motorola and now LG also.
Okay. LG seems to be a popular brand. Now, if you were living in Europe or the rest of the world, Nokia would be most likely the brand that you have. But what happened in the globalization thing? Nokia is the world leader and was the world leader everywhere. Two things happened to Nokia. First of all, they came from a background of supplying wood. They were a wood lumber supplier, and they bought a small company that made cell phones before cell phones became a part of the technology. And then they just dropped their wood line. They are a Finnish company. And they did very well, but they did not keep up with two things. One, the rest of the world has a different technology, the same technology that they use at AT&T and T-Mobile, which is GSM, Global Service Mobile, the cell phone. That was actually the technology that was developed by Motorola. Motorola developed cell phone. And then, but in America, they used a standard that's called CDMA. GSM became the next generation, but America had CDMA, a code division. And so they stayed with the first generation. The rest of the world went to do it the second generation, which included the GSM. Made it possible to go from country to country by just switching cards, or even not switching, just having an agreement between providers. Now, as you notice that Apple iPhone went with the GSM provider, which is AT&T. The main reason being because iPhone has plans for globalization of its product, which already sells in Europe and everywhere else. If it was on, like Verizon, a CDMA code, they wouldn't have been able to spread themselves globally. So decisions on the technology standard is very critical very often. That's why you see most new products come out of America. They come up in voltage of 110 or 115 volts, so they work in the American, in the South American, and the Canadian market. And only later they come out in 220 electrical configuration. These are not accidents. Now the Chinese got smart. They have, when they have charges and everything, they have it all the way from 115 to 240, so they cover any place. That's why you have charges. There's really no necessity. They could have built computers that convert inside the computer the current, that you don't need a charging unit. But then they would not have been able to globalize. They would have had to make one edition for the rest of the world and the other edition for the US and South America. So standards are very critical in this opportunity, recognizing what the opportunity. And also Nokia missed the market. They didn't realize. They stayed with the blocks in terms of the phone. You know, the cheaper phones that we started using when cell phones first came out. And people, people in America wanted the flip up, what they call a clam case. And now people want the BlackBerry, like one cell phone does it all. And Apple really tuned into this. You saw that Apple was the first to market, not only in America, but internationally. BlackBerry actually came first, but it was too complex. And the segmentation was only to the business market. And iPhone understood, Apple understood the consumer mind, the consumer that's willing to spend $700 on a telephone. Even though when we get it in America, we get it with a service. It's only $99 or $150 or $200, but you're obligated for 2 years, and they get their money back through the service company. Okay, so new markets, then a reduction in tariffs. A lot of products we go across country lines now are not bothered or bonded into taxes on importation. Standardization of some practices is another opportunity. Okay, we find that many products exist in one market, let's say abroad, and they do not exist in America, because those products come in units that we do not use. Standardization of products such as ounces, as opposed to deciliter or milliliters, liters as opposed to quarts. When you go to Europe, or you go most of the world, and you fill up your automobile at the pump, that's in liters. Anybody know offhand how many liters in 1 gallon? If you want to figure out how much more money you're paying in Europe on gas than you are in America, you better know that it's 3.7 liters to the gallon. You can calculate to really keep it, really comparison. So these are standards. The rest of the world has all gone into a decimal-based standard, based on tens. And we are using the Old English system, developed by British monarchs, and even preceded by the Egyptians and other cultures that developed measuring systems, which were either binomial, based on 0 ones, or they were based on things like the length of the hand. A yard, a foot. A foot was how big your foot was, if you were a Neanderthal man, I guess. And so standardization gives opportunities. If you're only doing things in the American standards, a foot, yard, pound, quart, you have a very limited market. So if you look at anything that we buy today, does anybody have here a cologne with them? Or a drink? There, I see, I'm spotting a drink. Give me a drink. There we have vitamin water right here. Okay, vitamin water. 20 fluid ounces. 591 milliliters. But if you were buying this drink anywhere else, you wouldn't buy a 591 milliliter drink. You'd be buying maybe 750 milliliters. In fact, that's how you buy liquor. So I guess the liquor industry understood 1 liter, 750 milliliters. And here we say, we call it a quart or a fifth. So you can see there's competitive advantage to standardization. Okay. Also, another global opportunity is higher living standards. As people make more money, the Chinese people in the last 20 years have made more money in terms of their living standard than ever before. They are now customers for many of the things we sell. And I just mentioned the iPhone as a typical example. We tried to sell them our automobiles, but they didn't want them. Why not? Why didn't the Chinese want our automobiles? Some of them. Because we didn't want them. Because we were buying Japanese. They said, hey, why should we buy what the Americans are buying? Maybe we should. And they bought Japanese cars also. Or they made their own Chinese car. There's the Happy, there's all kinds of Chinese made cars. And they took one terrible burden off the American economy. They took away the Hummer. The Chinese company now that owns Hummer. Because we didn't want to pay any more $500 to fill a tank on a Hummer. So, again, higher living standards. People attribute certain benefits and buy product, and that opens up markets for us. What are some of the risks and dangers of globalization? It's a lot more complex. You've got to satisfy a lot more markets. You've got to spread around also your production. If you're going to be a globalized player, you try to minimize your costs. Okay, minimize your production costs. Very critical if you're going to be in business. And you want to minimize your distribution costs. So you want to have plants close to your markets. You don't want to be spending, as we talked about the other day, on delivering products and services. Another issue is increased volatility. If you had a manufacturing plant that was making sandals in Afghanistan, you'd be in deep trouble. It's kind of tough to make sandals when rocket fire is all over you. But if you were in the narcotics business making morphine, hey, we were the poppies on. You know, because we found out that the Afghanistanis are not sending us flowers. They're sending opium base, you know, for like the more undesirable products that we can do without. And then there's human rights issue. We often find that people complain, especially in the US, that we're exploiting people in Indonesia or in China to make us running shoes, and they're working under inhumane conditions, and as you saw in the film. Is that true? What's the problem with that argument that buying Nikes or buying, I don't know, Billy Bond t-shirts is causing other people to work under inhumane conditions? What's wrong with that argument? Well, what's wrong with that argument is that if we didn't do that, those people might not have jobs at all. So yes, it's an ethical argument, but we cannot impose the living standards of what your domestic market demands with other markets. And if you're paying double the living wage in the country that you're producing a product, but it's still not the same as what you're producing back home, why would you price yourself out of the market? So I think that ethical debate is not going to be solved anytime soon. And if you're providing work and income to people who otherwise would not have any, I think you're already doing something that's worthwhile. But that's only my opinion. You may have your own. Now, if you're going to be in a company and you want to introduce globalization to your particular vision, it requires a lot more than just a design. So the first thing we're going to do, first of all, you have to be in a supportive culture. What does it mean to be in a supportive culture? Well, it means that everybody's pulling in the same deal. Everybody's backing the same idea. It's not easy to become a globalized player, because you're going into uncharted waters for many companies. America is used to supplying domestic market, and it's used to playing it safe back home and having distributors and not having to play directly. But often if you're going to take advantage of globalization processes or opportunities, you have to be there. You have to actually face the music, so to speak. And if you're going to want to supply those markets, just sending them a shipload is not enough. You're going to have to learn a lot of things about the culture. You have to learn about what people respond to. They don't always respond to what we expect. I just told you the story before about the Diet Coke. You can't just send a shipload of Diet Coke. You don't think it's going to go. And it reminds me of an incident I had a few years ago where we decided to import bottled water from a friendly country like New Zealand, where everybody speaks English. And we hyped it really up in Hawaii and in California and had deals with the hotels. And then to our dismay, when the first container arrived from New Zealand, and we distributed it to some hotels in Los Angeles, and we got phone calls like crazy. There was sand in the water. So apparently they just weren't very careful when they bottled the water, and we weren't careful in making sure when the container arrived to first do a spot check, because we assumed that we were dealing with a westernly oriented consumer market. But New Zealand is a very small country population-wise. The sheep outnumber the men and the women. So you're talking about not every level of expertise in every product line, but water is a fairly simple product. Just to show you how water can be a very dangerous product. How many of you have heard of Perrier? Bottled water, Perrier. Comes in a green bottle. Okay. That was a premium bottled water for years. Before bottled water became first a designer product and later on a commodity product as it is today. And Perrier was very arrogant. They had that French arrogance. We are so good, yes. We are wonderful. Yeah, wonderful. Except But someone didn't watch the production from that little spring. You know, you imagine having this little spring and it just pumps out the gold and just following them. And they got the exhaust from the pump engine into the water, and suddenly people were opening their Perrier bottles in Manhattan, top of a fancy French restaurant, and it smelled like gas, like Detroit City. What do you think that did to the brand? Took them years and millions of dollars in advertising to correct that little problem. So you can never be overconfident. And just because a marketplace is foreign, doesn't mean they will accept and take anything that you give them. And then you've got to be part of the worldwide information network if you're going to be in a globalized game. I don't know how many of you are aware that this morning it looks like Google is pulling out of China. Why are they pulling out of China? Because it seems that the Chinese government perhaps has been hacking their servers, trying to find out who the people who are dissident Chinese who might be on Gmail. So Google said enough, they're not going to enforce it anymore. They've been enforcing the, what do you call it? The screening on the Chinese website, the Google search site, so that people who search for things like Tiananmen Square or anything that might embarrass the Chinese government won't get any Google results. This goes contrary to the company corporate philosophy. Don't be evil. That's the corporate philosophy. And they felt that they finally had it after 4 years of trying to enforce, with a lot of criticism against the company for playing games with the Chinese government by allowing the Chinese government to dictate to them what kind of information to give on the Google search. Google is a company that makes, I think, $20 billion a year. So the China market is only about 600 million to them. So they're willing to forego that. Again, you see some of the issues and complexities of dealing. How do you deal with repressive regimes when you're an information provider? Interesting question. And you can see over here some of the countries that are most competitive. What do you think is number one in the most competitive countries? Oh, it's a thought question. What do you think? What would you believe would be the number one competition or competitive country? Who invented competition? Ding dong, ding dong, ding dong, ding dong, ding dong. It's called America. Hey! America is the number one competitive country. And if we look like down at number 20, it's the United Kingdom or Great Britain. And if we look at number 5, Iceland. Ah, what are they selling in Iceland? Well, I've been there too. Their capital is called Reykjavik. It's all ice and snow, but they got some thermal. They got some thermal pools, and you know, some of these nursing students, they like to get here early. What can I say? Okay. Now, one of the issues in globalization is what we call foreign direct investment. Remember, FDI. And that's when we go and invest in other countries as part of our mission or part of our policy of extending our reach from domestic to international business. And what can we do? Well, we can buy companies, we can buy subsidiaries, we can buy natural resources there, we can buy manpower, we can buy know-how, we can buy technology, and we can borrow capital or invest capital. So all these flows, capital, knowledge, material, all part of foreign direct investment. And you have to decide what are the things that are the low possible risks. So building a factory, is that low risk or high risk?
High risk.
High risk. How about sending a shipload of your product for possible distribution? Is that low risk or high risk? Compared to building a factory.
Low risk.
Low risk, right. I mean, the most if you send a shipload of supplies or automobiles or product, the most you can lose is a shipload. But if you set up a factory and you invest millions of dollars in building a plant and hiring people and setting systems and making arrangements and building infrastructure, if things go south or go sour, it's very tough to take out of the country. You're stuck. So when you enter the international marketplace, you have several options. You can enter as just an exporter, just sell them things. Or you can decide to go sell to a distributor on a regular basis. Or you can sell them directly. You can also go into a joint venture. One of the safest things to do is what we call licensing. You can actually send the know-how or the product design or allow them to manufacture things on your behalf, but using your brand name. So for instance, we have products like Polo by Ralph Lauren. Anybody ever see Ralph Lauren? Has he been around here lately? Just on a t-shirt or a polo golf shirt, right? Or a sport shirt. What's his logo? The polo, the guy on a pole with a polo stick on a horse. And I'm going to tell you a big secret. Don't tell anybody, okay? And all you people out there, don't tell anybody about the secret. The secret is that all that Ralph Lauren sells is his name. He has never made a shirt in the last 20 years. Never made a tie, never made a jacket. Doesn't have a shoe factory. All he does is send a contract, and if you want to manufacture something with his logo, every time you put that logo on a shirt, you send Ralph a check for $1.50 or whatever, $2. Good business, huh? Especially if you sell a few billion shirts and shoes and socks and underwear and cologne. Okay? So you see, business has many different transformations, especially globalized business. We're going to continue after the holiday. We'll see you next Wednesday. Have a good one. And think about all those poor people in Haiti.